Is being recorded.
Good morning. It's a beautiful day today, and I'm so glad that you decided to join me for Sunday school. I'll be continuing in the study of Romans in this book, session 10. I think it is 10. Let me check, make sure. Yep, session 10. And if you don't have that quarterly, then it's in Romans chapter 11, where Paul has been writing to the believers in the Roman church. The believers in the Roman church were made up of Jewish believers and Gentile believers. And it was his custom, as he would go on his missionary trips, that Paul would teach first and share first with the Jewish people, and then he would give them an opportunity to respond. Sometimes they believed and some did not, and that was a problem. But then he would begin to share with the Gentiles. In chapters 9 through 10 from last week, we're going to go back and review that Paul emphasized two main points from that part of his letter. First of all, salvation came through faith. The Jews who refused Christ believed that keeping the rules and the regulations offered sacrifice or offered salvation. But the second point that he wanted to make was that God's offer is of a universal nature. It was available for the Jewish people. It was available for the Gentile people, and under Gentile, that's a big umbrella because that would be anybody who was not a Jew, from any ethnic background, from any race, any creed, any color. So this good news that Paul shared among other people who missionaries at that time, um, it was good news for the Gentiles. That was very good that they were offered the gift of salvation, but it stirred up a lot of controversy with the Jewish people. After all, the Jewish people had been going by the rules and regulations that they had made and that supplemented the Ten Commandments that God gave to Moses, and they were a little bit like us. Um, we've been doing it that way, and it's worked. And although they didn't realize that it really was not working because no one was perfect enough to abide by all the rules and the regulations, but they didn't want to change their way of doing business. But despite their stubbornness, Paul knew that God had not given up on his people, on his chosen people. In chapter 11, verse 1, he asked a rhetorical question. He said, "Did God reject his people?" And the answer was by no means. God did not reject his people. Paul himself was an example that God had not rejected. After all, he was from the tribe of Benjamin, who was one of the Jewish tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. And another rhetorical question in chapter 11, verse 11 was, well, did they stumble so far that they are beyond recovery? And he said, not at all, because the chosen people, the Jewish, rejected Jesus, then that offered up an opportunity for salvation for the Gentiles. Now, that was planned all along that all would be able to be blessed by God. But because the Jewish people refused to believe at times, then God worked it out in another way. And when he started blessing the Gentiles, just like human nature is, the Jewish people sometimes would become jealous and see all the work and all the blessings that God was doing through the Gentile nation, and they would turn back to God. And they did run a little bit of a roller coaster. If you studied the Old Testament, the Jews would turn to God and then they would turn away from God. And we're like that sometimes when our life is wonderful, we sort of forget that God's the one that's blessing us. And when things get rough, then we want to get on our knees then and pray fervently to God. But Paul began in his letter then to write specifically to the Gentiles. The letter was for all of the believers of the Roman church, but right now he's going to switch over and write specifically to the Gentiles, and he was going to use an illustration that they could understand. He was a good speaker. He could speak to his audience in ways that they could understand. And this illustration that he used was an olive tree. The olive tree was used to symbolize Israel many times in the Old Testament. And what they did at that time was they would take the branches of a domestic or a cultivated olive tree and they would graft it onto the trunk and the root system of a wild olive tree. And they did this because the branches of the cultivated trees produced really good fruit. But the tree and the root system was not strong enough to hold the branches or to sustain it. But the thing about it is the illustration that Paul used was exactly the opposite of that. He said, oh, well, we've got a domestic tree and its root system, which would represent Israel, and the root system that sustained it and blessed it, of course, was God. And he said, we've got this domestic tree, and some of the branches fell off. So that means some of the Jewish people turned away. They fell away from the blessings or from the tree. That represented those unbelieving Jews. But he said, now we're going to take some branches from a wild tree, a wild olive tree, and we're going to graft it onto that domestic tree. So the branches from the wild olive tree actually represented the Gentile believers. And that's the exact opposite of what they actually did during that time with their grafting system. But not all of the domestic branches fell off. And if you see in the Bible, many times God always preserved a remnant of believers. So some of the branches of that cultivated tree stayed on, and that would be the remnant or the part that represented the Jewish believers. So that brings us up to verse 17 now, and it says, and if some of the branches be broken off, and you, Gentiles, he's writing to the Gentiles now, and thou, being a wild olive tree, wert grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. In other words, the blessings and the nurturing and the sustainment of the root system, that would be God. He said, but boast not against the branches, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. So Paul was a little bit afraid that these believing Gentiles would develop an air of superiority and think, well, God must love us more than he does the Jews because he cut those branches away so that we could be grafted in. And that's not what he said. He said those branches fell off. And he had to remind them now that, the same root system that supplies to them is the same root system that's supplying to the domestic branches that stayed on the tree. And he said, you're the branches. You don't sustain the roots. The roots sustain you. In other words, you don't keep God going. God keeps you going, as well as the other believers. And, human nature, sometimes we do want to feel like we are loved a little bit more, superiority. I was the baby in my family, and I know my mom and daddy loved me more than they did my 8 brothers and sisters. But I know that each one of them felt like that they were the special one, that mom and daddy loved them the most too. And so it's human nature that we have a way of thinking that, well, we're special. We're the ones that are special. And Paul was trying to remind them before it ever even started, don't ever start thinking this way. And then in verses 19 through 20, he's warning them still. He said, Gentiles, thou, talking to the Gentiles, wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief, they were broken off. In other words, God had not stopped loving the people of Israel. He did not cut off the natural branches in order to make room for the Gentiles to come in. Originally, God's covenant with Abraham was so that all people on earth would be blessed. He told Abraham when Abraham was 99 and Sarah was 90 that their descendants they didn't have any children at that time either, by the way. I'll just remind you. But he told them, God made that covenant with Abraham, and he said, your descendants will be like the sands on the seashore. That's how they'll be numbered. They'll be numbered like the stars in the sky. Now, at 99 and 90, with no children at all, you might think, well, God, how are you going to do that? But he said, and they will be my people, and I will be their God, and through them, all the people of the earth would be blessed. So he's telling these Gentile believers, now be careful and don't start thinking that you might be a little bit superior, because God did not cut those branches off. He did not take those unbelievers away to make room for you. they fell away because of their unbelief. And you happened to be along and you did believe and you were added. And he said, well, because of unbelief, they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. That's how you came to be a part of this tree, is that you believed and you accepted by faith. He said, be not high minded, but fear. And not to be afraid, but be respectful, and make sure you remember where you were at one time in your life. He said, because if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. He said, hey, this was God's chosen people, and they chose to not believe in his son Jesus, and they dropped off. Do the same thing that God wouldn't do to you. Be careful that God would keep you. He said salvation comes only from faith. So if we have salvation and it's only through faith, no believer has a reason to feel superior over any other believer. We have no reason except to feel humble along with other believers and to feel merciful toward them and to be thankful to God. He said, because they didn't drop away, God didn't stop loving them. That was their choice. And God gives us choices. And sometimes we don't make the right choice. And sometimes we have to take the consequences of our choices. And then in verse 22, he says, behold, therefore, in other words, take notice, pay attention to what I'm going to say, to what I'm going to tell you, because it's very important. You know, we do that. We say, listen, look at me when I talk to you. It's very important. You need to get this. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. In other words, God is a good God, but he is not so kind that he's going to overlook evil. But then he's not so harsh that he's going to condemn without due cause. You know, some people think that God is above us and he's got a finger pointed, and I'll get that one for this and I'll get this one. God doesn't work that way. He's not out to get us. He's out to love us and to bless us. But sometimes we put ourselves in positions that we feel like, okay, well, you know, we're not blessed. Well, it's our choice that we've made at times. And he says, think about the goodness and the severity of God. He said, on them which fell, severity, that would be the Jewish non-believers, the severity, but toward thee, the believers, goodness. And then he says, if thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. Now, he was not saying that you could lose your salvation. You might be cut off from the blessings of God, but if you've accepted Christ as your Savior, you're not going to lose that. In the Old Testament, when they did live by the laws, the rules, and the regulations and the Ten Commandments, there were a lot of sacrifices that had to be made. Burnt offerings, sacrifice for peace offering. I can't even name all of them. A sacrifice for atonement of sins, the grain offering, guilt offering. There were so many sacrifices that had to be made, and they were very specific too. If you go and read it, it'll say the law of the atonement, the law of the sacrifice of peace offering. Each one had specifics that had to be followed, specific guidelines. And it was hard for an ordinary person to be able to follow all the guidelines of all the sacrifices that came along with living by the law. So God provided a new way through sacrificing his son for our behalf. And that is the only sacrifice that ever needed to be made beyond that point. And if we could lose our salvation, if we accept Christ, in last Sunday's lesson it said, confess or agree that Jesus was the Son of God, and trust in your heart, if we actually have gained our salvation, and then we can lose it because of our sin, and we all sin. I don't care what position you might have in a church, we're all sinners, and one sin does not outweigh another. They're not on a balance beam and say, okay, this one's heavier than that one. Their sin is a sin. And he said, if we could lose that, if we could lose our salvation, then Jesus suffered and died for nothing. If that was not the ultimate sacrifice that was made and the only one that was required on our behalf, then no, we can't lose our salvation, but we might put ourselves in a position where we lose the blessings that God would like to give to us. Now, in verses 23 and 24, well, let me talk a little bit more about Paul, because Paul was a Jew, and his history is amazing to me, because Paul was a non-believing Jew, and this is how he knew that God would not turn his back on his people. He was a non-believing Jew. I don't know what I think he might have been a tent maker or something, but he had been trained by Pharisees, and they were the haughtier group of non-believing Jews. But Paul's job was to go out and seek out the believing Jews. They were persecuted, they were arrested, they were put in jail, and Paul was really good at what he did. That was his job. He was really good. And the believing Jews had a fear of Paul, but he met Jesus on the road to Damascus one day, and actually he was traveling to Damascus in order to find more believing Jews to bring them to Jerusalem and put them in jail. But he met Jesus along the way. And just as good as Paul was at tracking down and persecuting believing Jews, he became that fervent and that burning desire as a believing Jew to be able to teach all the others, everybody that he could come in contact with, other Jews, and the Gentiles. He wanted all to know. So Paul was not just talking about a theory when he said that God showed mercy upon his people and that he didn't turn his back on his people, meaning the Jewish people. That was his testimony, because he knew God had not turned his back on him. And he was really good at persecuting the people who did trust and believe in God. So in verses 23 and 24, it says, and they also, that would be the Jews who who were not believers. He said, and they also, talking about the branches that had fallen off, if they abide not still in unbelief. In other words, if they don't continue in their path of unbelief, they shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. Now, when we're actually physically grafting a branch from a tree, if you cut it off and you leave it laying on the ground for a while, and evidently these non-believing Jews were non-believers for a while, but if you leave that branch laying there, you can't pick it up, graft it, because it's already dead. It's lost its will, its chance at life. But he said, oh, these people, even if they haven't believed for a while, he said, if they don't continue in that path, God can pick them right back up and graft them onto the tree. He says, for if thou wert cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature. I mean, it's not very natural that we would take a wild something and graft it onto a one that we're growing, that we're cultivating. He said, if that's contrary to nature, and he said, if you were grafted on, then how much more shall these, which be the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? So he said, if I can take a wild branch and graft it onto a domestic tree and it can survive, how much better do you think I can take my own domestic branch and graft it on and it will divide? And he said, God does not follow our rules. Now, that's not the way that we would graft a branch onto a tree if we were doing that. But God doesn't go by our rules. He does his own thing. And the thing about it is, God is able to do just that. Now, in verse 25, he goes on and he says, for I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery. In other words, he said, I really, really, really don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery. And the mystery is God's plan of salvation through Jesus. That was a mystery, but now it's being made known. Paul is out teaching it to others. Many other apostles and missionaries are teaching it to others. He said, I want you to know about this plan of salvation that God has, because this plan of salvation requires two things: you to confess and to believe. And it does not you don't have to do all of these offerings and sacrifices that were a part of the laws in the Old Testament. We've got a new covenant here. He said, lest you should be wise in your own conceits. That blindness in part, meaning that only some of the Jews had been blinded, only some of the Jews were non-believers, is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. only some of the Jews had hardened their hearts. Some of the branches of that domestic tree were left intact through all situations in the Bible. If you study the Bible, you'll know that God keeps a remnant of believers at all times. They're never all wiped out. Now, we go over to the next verse, and this verse had a little bit of a controversy when people started trying to interpret it, because it says, and so all Israel shall be saved. Now, we know that not everybody is saved. You're only saved if you accept Christ. But now, Paul used the word Israel in Galatians, which is in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, Galatians 6:16. Paul used that term Israel to refer to God's church. Well, God's church is not a structure, but it is a group of believers. And if you are a group of believers, then you are saved, whether you're Jewish or whatever. And he says, peace and mercy to all who follow this rule, to the Israel of God. Now, there were a lot of different, because it says all Israel. And I've searched in lots of different places and read so that I could understand this a little bit more. But this is what we do know. What we do know about this is God does not save everyone, every individual person. It's up to every individual person to accept the gift that God has given. And it says, as it is written there, and it's written in Isaiah 59:20. He was quoting that. Now, Isaiah's from the Old Testament, Paul's in the New Testament. He's teaching the new gospel that comes through Jesus Christ, but he said he's referring back to Isaiah 59:20. This was a direct quote. It said, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. Well, Jesus was born in the Jewish lineage, and so that all could be saved. And he's saying this, and Jacob would be the last one that the old covenant was made with. It was Abraham, then passed to Isaac, then passed to Jacob. And he said, Jesus is the one who's going to provide the forgiveness. He said, for this is my covenant unto them when I shall take away. And number one from this, Israel does not refer to every individual Jew. And number two is that however God includes Israel, salvation is always going to come through faith in Jesus Christ. Now, in this next part, in the last part there, it says, for this is my covenant unto them when I shall take away. He was referring there to Jeremiah 31, Jeremiah chapter 31 in the Old Testament. Now, you know, the Jewish people held a lot of stock in some of their prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah. And here, Paul was referring to what Jeremiah said in the Old Testament. I wanted to read that. It says, the days, this is the Old Testament, and it was foretelling about the Jesus that was coming, that was going to provide a new covenant, not the laws and not all those sacrifices and rituals that had to be completed. He said, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. And it says Israel and Judah. You know that Israel was one nation, and then after the death of King Solomon, Israel was divided into two nations. The northern part was still called Israel. Southern part was called Judah. The southern part, Judah, is where Jerusalem was located, and that was the capital of all of the worship center. So when he says the people of Israel and the people of Judah, he's actually talking about the original nation of Israel that was divided at one time. And it says, here's what this new covenant, it will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors. Now that would be the covenant he's talking about with Abraham and his descendants, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and these descendants. He said, I'm making a new covenant, and it's not going to be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant. And the people could not abide perfectly by those rules and regulations, and that's why it was so hard to not break the covenant. He said, though I was a husband to them, a husband, a leader, a master, a guide, declares the Lord. Now, this is the good part. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. The law in the Bible, the law that they took so seriously, and we do take seriously, but it's a guide for our life. We don't have it plastered so that we're going through all sorts of sacrifices. We've got it in our minds, we've got it in our hearts. And he said, that's where I'm going to put it. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And this one, no longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord. And this is why, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. Now, when is our wickedness forgiven and our sins remembered no more? And that is when we accept and we have faith in Jesus Christ. So he was foretelling in Jeremiah about the coming of Jesus. And then Paul talks about it here in this. He said, this is my covenant unto them when I shall take away their sins. That's the covenant that he was talking about, the new one that he made when he sent Jesus to this earth. And then in verses 28, 29, it says, as concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sakes. In other words, by the Jews turning away from God, that opened up the door for the Gentiles. He said, but as touching the election, because they were God's chosen people, they are still loved by God. He says, they are beloved for the Father's sake. For the gifts and calling of God, that would be Israel's status, are without repentance. In other words, it's without regret that God chose Israel, and he has not rejected them. God said, I don't regret what I've done, and I don't regret that these were my chosen people, but I'm working it all out for everybody. And it says in verses 30, 32, for as ye in times past have not believed. He's talking to the Gentiles specifically now in this letter, this part of the letter. The Gentiles didn't always believe. And, we might need to remind ourselves sometimes that we didn't always believe either. And we can't be judgmental, because earlier it says we have no way to be except humble to the other believers and thankful to God, because we were in the same boat. For ye in times past have not believed God, yet have now obtained mercy through their unbelief. Even so have these also now not believed, that through your mercy they also may obtain mercy. For God has concluded them all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon them. And in a nutshell, it says this: in God's mercy and grace, disobedience led to obedience, and no mercy led to mercy. But that's not because of anything that we did. That is because of what God has done for us through his mercy and through his grace that has come about. And so when all is said and done, we all need to be grafted into God's tree. None of us are good enough to earn our salvation. We all have to come before God in faith and in trust. So the question for our self-evaluation from this lesson, I believe, is this: have you been grafted onto the tree, or are you one of the branches that's laying on the ground beside the tree? And you need to get picked up and grafted in onto the tree. But the next question is this: if you have been grafted onto the tree, are you producing good fruit, or are you just hanging on to the tree just for dear life? Now, I want to thank you for joining. I hope this lesson, as I've tried to present it, has been meaningful in some way. That's my prayer, that it would be meaningful to you. I study it and I know what I'm trying to say, and I hope that maybe you can figure out what I'm trying to say too. And I pray that we all continue in our prayers for everything that goes on in our world today. And do remember this: even in the worst of days, we are so blessed. And God has a plan for everything that's going on right now in our world. And his plan is so much more than anything that we could comprehend or that we can come up with, because Remember the grafting of the tree, the wild branches on the domestic tree. God doesn't follow our rules. He does it the way he plans to do it. And I thank you for coming. Thank you for joining me.
That the biggest thing is that because we rolled it out as subscriber retargeting, they're having a really hard time understanding how you aggressively target someone that's not a subscriber. Yeah, right.